of you were here, well not here, some of you were with us in December when we last talked about what President Erdogan was up to. We had Reşat Kasaba of the Jackson School joining us then, and we're very happy to have Reşat joining us again today, and very grateful to the Jackson School for sponsoring this event so that we could all have these delightful lunches, so to have sustenance to go along with the mental sustenance that is about to start. So thank you for support of this event and for coming here. Now, when we last talked in December, Turkey had more journalists being detained than any other country. The opposition was harassed, and there was a delegitimization, that's a word, campaign going on. The AKP was campaigning to maintain its then 12-year rule, and Erdogan was hollowing out political institutions in his pursuit of a super presidency to move away from this parliamentary system to a super executive presidential regime. As a result, relations between the US and Turkey and the EU and Turkey were strained, to say the least, with Biden calling Erdogan's attempts at gathering political power corrosive, and Erdogan saying of Western countries, "Believe me, they don't like us. They look like friends, but they want us dead. They like seeing our children die." So that's where we were in December. We also had, of course, the strains in foreign policy, with Turkey allowing ISIS fighters to cross the border pretty freely into Syria, but also Turkey taking in about 2 million Syrian refugees and really bearing the brunt, aside from the refugees themselves, but bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis and their discontent with what the West had not been doing in Syria. So it was a complex political environment in December. And the June 7th legislative elections have made things even more interesting and even more complicated. For some, this election has proven that Turkey is a democracy, because even though the campaign featured extreme polarization, violence, some deaths, intimidation of the media, and unequal access to the media, at the end of the day, there was a massive turnout, something like 86%. The votes were tallied and the results were respected. So what's next for Turkey? Now you'll know why we have Reşat here, but if you don't, you can read his bio. He is a national Turkey expert, a very close local friend of the World Affairs Council, and he's going to talk us through the implications of this important election. And as I said at the outset, I was surprised by this outcome. The AKP had a dominant position for the past 13 years now, and in this election fell 18 seats short of a majority. So we're now looking at coalitions or snap elections in the future, and we'll get to that. And as I said, I was surprised. I think a lot of coverage, there was a lot of surprise. Were you surprised? Did you see this coming? Did the Turkey experts see this coming? And what was Erdogan aiming for, and what did he actually achieve in this election?
Okay. Well, before I start, I also want to thank Jackie and the World Affairs Council for hosting me, but also in particular for the extraordinary dynamism that the Council has now. The events, just you saw some examples of it just within the next few days or so, and this has been like that all through the year, so I'm very, I know how hard it is to put these things together, so thank you for all your work, and thank you for organizing this. This is, I've been looking forward to this conversation because it is a momentous event, the elections, and I think it's always good for us who are interested in these events to have the opportunity to discuss the implications of what's going on and how. So was I surprised? Now, a lot of people make a living, commenting on foreign affairs on television, and they say different things every day, and they never act surprised. And they'll say something, and exactly the opposite happens, and then they find a way of explaining it so it doesn't move on. Now, I think everybody was surprised. I was surprised too. It is a big deal. What happened is a big deal in Turkey. I don't know if at the end of the day, what will happen, we will talk about that later on today. But the elections were a big deal, the outcome of the elections. First of all, it is a big deal for AKP. That's the party that's been in government now since 2002, the party that's been led by Erdogan. Because this is the first time since 2002, depending on how you count, because there's been some referenda, there's been some local elections. They won pretty much 7 consecutive elections, and they won this one too. So how, you know, in a way it's less than what they expected, but they're still the largest party. But this is the first time since 2009, actually, in the local elections, they got less than 40%. So that's the first time they came close to 40%. Just 4 years ago, AKP had almost 50% of the vote, and it was a big success then. So that is for AKP. This signals a turn, an inflection of some sort. So it's a big deal for that party, and trying to figure out, the party itself is trying to figure out what to make of it and how to deal with it. For Turkey, it is a big deal because really Turkey was on the verge of becoming a different kind of entity, a highly powerful executive presidency rather than the parliamentary system that Turkey has been using for all of its modern history. Erdogan was interested in bringing a system that was much more centered on a single president, and the way he was approaching this did look more like a country that would be more similar to perhaps the darkest days of Ba'athist Iraq or Syria or more contemporary Russia, maybe a single person, a president, very powerful, and able to kind of rule over the executive branch single-handedly. So that is off the books now, at least for the foreseeable future. So for Turkey, it's a big deal. Now for Erdogan also, I think it is a big deal. Because he really, even though he had plans to change the constitution, he really was out there campaigning until the very last days of legal campaigning period in Turkey, really trying to push the people to vote for him. And not only that, he also singled out the Kurdish party, which is listed as HDP on your little cheat sheets here. And he said that if you vote for that party, you're voting against me. So he made it really a personal issue, and it looks like it turned out people, when they heard that, they went out and voted for him. So it's a personal, very public kind of embarrassment for him, and that is important too, because he has dominated the Turkish political scene and continues to do so since the turn of the 21st century. And not only that, there is nobody else in Turkish political sort of horizon or the field that comes even close to rivaling him in terms of power, but we can talk about this later on too. So for him too, it's really something he's not used to being publicly humiliated like that. This is a man who, if he gets a personal insult from someone, he just gives it back personally. It doesn't matter if it's an official or a government, high-level bureaucrat. There are even rumors that he would slap the ministers if they did something that he didn't like. If they smoke for him, I mean, smoking. So that is, for him though, this is something he's not accustomed to, this kind of embarrassment. So it is a big deal, and we're all saying, and it makes it even more significant because it comes at a time when Turkey is dealing with some serious economic issues. After years of respectable growth and expansion, Turkish economy has turned now for the worse. And we can also touch upon that later. And of course, there are very serious foreign policy challenges that are very hard to deal with. So it is a big deal. Was I surprised? I was surprised. I was personally expecting all attention was focused on the Kurdish party, because if that party passed this 10% threshold, which the party has to have at least 10% of the national vote in order to have candidates. So if you have
And that's an
9%,
extraordinarily high
it's
threshold.
very high threshold, because if you have 9%, you can imagine you have 4 parties and each one gets 9%. So you are talking about 36% of the electorate with no representation in the parliament. So for a party that is identified as a Kurdish party, a regionally based party, it always seemed really impossible for them to get that national 10%. So all attention was focused on that, because if they got the 10%, then they would have enough representation in the parliament, which then would make it very difficult for Erdogan to institute this presidential system. I expected them to get about very close to 9% or so. That's their natural base. And I thought that there would be a lot of fraud, because people were expecting that there would be a lot of cheating going on, and that through that cheating, I thought they would be prevented from getting the 10% threshold. So I thought that he would get enough, or maybe with some outside support, enough votes to change the system. So that was my expectation. So I was surprised. But it is a very uncertain period for Turkey for the reasons.
Let's see if we can break down, if it's possible to find one or two reasons, but why this might have happened. You said we've got some, Turkey's got some serious foreign policy crises, war in Syria, they want Assad out, millions of refugees into Turkey, declining, very poor relations right now with the US and the EU. So that's the foreign policy bucket. As you hinted at, there are some economic issues. The strong economic growth is declining. People are starting to feel that. There have been protests in Turkey with the media crackdowns and also then Erdogan's power play, right? To really build this almost cult of personality focused on him and accumulating power personally to him. Is there any indication yet at this point as to what people were voting against? Was it Erdogan specifically? We saw only 13% for the Kurdish party if it was the anti-Erdogan vote. Can you help us figure out what might have happened here?
I mean, he has become, on one level, he has become a polarizing figure, but I think there is something deeper going on in Turkey, and it is really ironic. I mean, those of you who are familiar with Turkey will know that Turkish Republic was established in 1923, and it was established as a unified nation state based on this Turkish identity, and it was established on this principle of very forceful, directed, determined move towards westernization and modernization under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Now, when you look back at that period in 1920s, Turkey actually was not unified as such. There were non-Turkish communities living in Turkey, and the largest one of them were Kurds, as many as maybe 25% of the population. And Turkey, of course, was very strongly conservative country. Its culture was very Islamic and very conservative. So those were really, that was the people that made up the new country. So the system, when it came to being in 1920s, really tried to ignore these two elements. There was a determined push towards secularization, which meant that really forceful separation of religion from public expression or political life, and control of religion by state in a very, very strong way. And also there was, for the longest time, a very determined policy of assimilation towards Kurds. It was really from the very beginning, 1920s on, it was a policy of either keeping Kurds out or ignoring their existence, etc. So those two are really two weaknesses of the Republic that the Republic never really dealt with straightforward. So when you come to 2014, it is ironic that the two groups are in a position of determining the future of modern Turkey are, on the one hand, this party that comes from the Islamic background, AKP, and the other is the Kurdish party, which then after, 90 years after the establishment of the Republic, is now in a position of determining the nature of Turkish politics. So why is this happening? I think this is a result of, in a way, the success of Turkish modernization. So that is something that I think people should really keep in mind, because the policy of modernization was from top to bottom, ignored all these elements, but one aspect of it was, of course, growth, integration of people into modern society, migration of rural people, peasants into big cities, expansion of education, more communication. So it became at some point impossible to ignore both the Islamic culture in some ways and also the Kurdish groups who were very important, especially in southeastern Turkey. So that is, I think, in a way, you can see this as Turkish political system becoming even more inclusive and more open. Anyway, so that's something that comes from within. Now, on a very general level, I don't think this is a bad thing, and it is good for Turkish democracy. It's good for Turkey to have more voices and discussion and real debate about the future of the country. So that is good. There is one, well, actually, I would say maybe two weaknesses of both the political system and the political system in Turkey. Now, one is these two parties, AKP and the Kurdish party, they come from these different sources, one from the religious background, one's ethnic background. So they each have really fundamentally determined believers, the core of their party. So there are Kurdish nationalists in the Kurdish party, and there are really groups that are close to fundamentalist way of thinking about religion in the Islamic party. Now these are the core. So if you took away everything, each would have about 8 to 9% support actually. So they can win only if they expand their appeal. AKP did this very successfully in the 21st century. They appeared a lot liberal, more inclusive, and that was the basis of their success. People who are not religious, who don't believe in Islamic fundamentalism or anything, ended up voting for this party because they were much more inclusive. Now the Kurdish party is doing the same thing. That they are speaking a much more liberal, open kind of language, and they are appealing, especially to the young people who were mobilized during Gezi demonstrations. So that is on the basis of their success. Now the problem is, of course, they are appealing to a group that you can recognize more open, inclusive, democratic, liberal, who are in the middle, but who don't really have a very clear party that they feel comfortable with. So they are up for grabs in the middle. So that makes, of course, political system dynamic and interesting, but somewhat unstable. Because in a way there is a vacuum in the middle, and it's a system that is very likely to become polarized very quickly. Now, the other weakness, I said there are two weaknesses. The other weakness has to do with institutions. This is a democracy that now existed, depending on how you look at it. Turkish democracy goes back to 1840s. I mean, that was the first time the Ottoman Sultan had local people vote for local councils. It was a very momentous event, and local people, I mean, when that happened, people were very puzzled. They didn't know why they were voting, what was the whole point. But that was really, if you think about it, there is a democratic tradition. But what we have found out, especially with Erdogan in the last few years, is that the key institutions of democracy in Turkey, like the press, these universities, these human rights organizations, general NGOs, judiciary, very important. These are not autonomous enough from the executive branch. So there is no checks and balances are not very well established. So someone like Erdogan can dominate the scene very quickly, can manipulate the police and the judiciary, and try to redirect the direction of Turkish society single-handedly. So it is a, kind of, on the one hand, I think the people are voting, trying to vote for things that they believe in. They voted strategically, so that is true that, this is an election that Erdogan lost, personally. A lot of people, more than the Kurdish party, a lot of people voted against him specifically. But then for the future of Turkish democracy, there are still these weaknesses that are more institutional and historical.
So the next step in Turkey is the prime minister resigned as he needs to, and is going to be tapped to form a coalition government since the AKP.
Yeah.
I'm going American.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Got the most votes.
Yeah.
They're going to be tasked with trying to form a government. So they're going to need to have a coalition. Several of the parties, including the Kurdish party, have said no go on a coalition. So is there a possibility we're returning to the 1990s and the 2000s for Turkey, where you had a series of unstable coalition governments almost at war with each other? The military was able to overthrow an Islamist government in 1997. The economy was not strong. Turkey's desire to be recognized as a regional power, gone. Are we looking at a return? Does this one election perhaps portend a return to the Turkey of the 1990s and 2000s?
I think, it's hard to say, of course, in the long term, but I think no matter how you look at it, it is a period of uncertainty and instability, and it's likely to continue for a while. Now, you are right that one way or another there has to be a coalition of some sorts, but it's very strange because AKP and the second largest party, Republican People's Party, which is kind of original Atatürk's party actually, has been really essential in the whole organization of the republic. Those are the two largest parties. It is in some ways very natural or logical for the two of them to get together and form a grand coalition like the one you have in Germany. But of course the whole election campaign, especially for the Republican People's Party, was premised upon calling the AKP representatives, ministers, and the President Erdogan's son to account for all the corruption and the misdeeds that were publicly, announced, and you could hear about them. They were taped and on. So the corruption investigation was stopped by Erdogan, so none of these people really suffered any consequences for their misdeeds. So the whole election campaign was based on that. So it is the only way in which RPP, this Republican People's Party, can go into an election with AKP is if they say, well, all right, now we will forget about all these corruptions and we will get these ministers, and so that will mean continuation of AKP and other guys. If they insist on investigations, I find it very hard to believe. He likes political power. I find it very hard, it would be Shakespearean for him to sacrifice his son so that he can continue power. So that is really, some of it is very personal, but of course he himself, I'm sure he has some things that he wants to hide also. So in a way, so that is really hard to believe how that can happen. Now if you look at the other two parties, they both have 80 seats, and it happens that one of them is an extreme Turkish nationalist party, and the other one comes from the Kurdish nationalist origins. Now the Turkish Nationalist Party still insists on the non-existence of Kurdish ethnicity, a legal kind of legitimate Kurdish ethnicity in Turkey. And they already said that they will not go into any coalition with the Kurdish party under any circumstances. And the same is true with the Kurdish party. So it's very hard, unless each one of these parties sacrifice their fundamental sort of reasons for being, it's hard to imagine how they can come together in a coalition. So the scenario is they will go through the motions. It is likely that there will be another election, which interestingly, in the West, sometimes these are referred to as snap elections, but Erdogan made a point of referring to it as rerun, because the idea is that he wants to show people that if people don't vote for AKP, then what you get is instability and chaos. So I think one of his hopes is that if there's another election, people will say, oh, we made a mistake, we will go back and vote for you again. So at least for the immediate future, I don't really see a very clear way out, unless some people who are in a position to do so make some big compromises and find a way of getting together. So that is really politically that's I think.
So Erdogan's probably what he's gunning for is that do-over.
Yeah.
If people are voting strategically, to scare them into getting the AKP over the 50% threshold. I want to turn quickly to foreign policy because there's certainly a lot going on there. Is there a lot of daylight between these various parties in terms of what their foreign policy goals would be? I mean, Erdogan, wants Assad out. Kurds probably not supporting him either. Could we expect a change in foreign policy if there is a change in government, or are kind of the fundamentals that divide Turkish politics really domestic and not foreign policy issues?
What has been happening now is not only in Turkey, but in many countries, foreign policy has become very closely intertwined with domestic politics and ethnic groups, religious groups, etc. So it's becoming more and more difficult to separate them. But I think, under AKP, under Erdogan, there has been a fundamental change in Turkish foreign policy. From a very long tradition of not really being that involved in the Middle East, and during the Cold War, basically following sort of American interest and American foreign policy in the region, Turkey moved to a position where it has become more and more active, and active in a way of really trying to be a main player in the region. And specifically, as part of what is emerging as a Sunni alliance in the region that includes some of the big Sunni states of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Egypt under Morsi, but that's changed. So that is, and specifically against Shia and Alevi interests. So Syria fits into that. So it has become not just a neighbor, but an important player. Now, in terms of specific interests, there are ways in which different political parties actually agree on a number of things. For example, in addition to being this part of the Sunni alliance, Erdogan has also become very nationalistic, and so much so that the impression is that he sees a Kurdish entity in northern Syria and Iraq, an independent state of Kurdistan, for example, as a bigger threat for Turkish interests than ISIS is. So, time and again, he has refused to help the Kurdish fighters who are fighting ISIS, and the impression is that for him, for Turkey, it's a nationalist way of thinking about the region. It's anti-Kurdish, and on that he wouldn't have any problems with a party like Nationalist Action Party. So it is, but what has happened is that since 2001, 2002, under AKP, as Turkey became interested in becoming more and more involved, it has lost a lot of its prestige, a lot of its ability to play an active role, because one of Turkey's advantages was that it was in a position to talk to all the powers in the region. Really, a good relation with Israel, but also with Iraq and Syria and Russia and the United States. So it was in a position to really mediate a lot of things in the region. As it became more and more partisan in the region, ironically, it has become less and less effective. So it's now becoming more of an observer of what's happening rather than being in a position to affect. But what's happening in the region, of course, out of Turkey is very dangerous, really, because the ethnic composition, especially of southeastern Turkey, is very similar to the ethnic composition of northern Syria and northern Iraq. So as things get out of control in those parts, it is very likely that sooner or later they will have more serious repercussions for Turkey. So it's a very uncertain, very dangerous time, and it is really too bad that Turkey is getting into this political instability at such a time.
And I'm just going to ask one quick follow-up question, then we'll turn it over to your questions. Especially if you're on this side of the room, you're kind of in my blind spot there, so wave your hand wildly so I can make sure I can see you out of the corner of my eye. One more kind of follow-up on that foreign policy. And Erdogan's ideology wasn't just nationalistic, it was nationalistic defined as being in opposition to the West, an anti-Western, anti-imperialist ideology, which of course strained relations with the West. Do you think the U.S. is breathing a sigh of relief and kind of happy that Erdogan's got his comeuppance, or is the U.S. going, oh God, what now?
It's hard to say, but I think for U.S., I think a lot of people, are happy that Erdogan got this kind of response and humiliated like this as a result of these elections because of the direction that he was moving. But I think what is really against U.S. interests is to have a Turkey that is unstable and weak. And that, I think, in the long term would probably be even worse for U.S. interests in the region. And I have to say that this is also true for Israel. I know that Turkish relations with Israel have deteriorated very much, and Israel especially is very happy about the result of these elections. But for Israel too, I think a weak Turkey that is really unstable is not a very good thing. So, that's you have it.
All right, please just raise your hand. I will call on you. Please make sure that we have questions and not necessarily speeches. And we don't have a roaming mic, so please speak loudly. And if you can't hear the question, raise your hands and we will repeat it for you. Donald in the back.
Yeah. Is there a significant Shia minority in Turkey at all?
Yes, it's a group actually. That's referred to as Alevis, Alevites. These are the same Shia branch that dominates Syrian government in Syria. And now Turkey has stopped counting these for most of the 20th century, but the estimates are about 25% of Turkish population are somehow related to this branch of Islam.
About 3 years ago, there was a land use dispute at the square. I think about 3 years ago, there was a land use dispute about construction around the square. I think it's on the European side.
Yes.
And you can say this better than me. It's been 18 years since I was there, but it basically morphed. It was, the people who were demonstrating were repressed, and the history of this. Basically, it seemed like it was led by young professionals, similar to our millennials here.
Yeah.
Did their voting patterns change any?
I think this was one of the groups that I was referring to earlier, this younger, more liberal, environmentalists, etc. groups who don't always find a political party that responds to their needs. And one of the successes of the Kurdish party was that it really campaigned very strategically to respond to groups like that. So a lot of young people who were active in those demonstrations supported the Kurdish party because it appeared to be much more liberal and open and much younger, really a very young group of people. It was from 30s and 40s, really, most of the people who got elected on their ticket. So that is a new development in Turkey, and but groups like that, of course, don't always have a staying power either. They come together for a cause, and then they tend to disappear. But this is an interesting development that they were able to kind of join forces with the Turkish.
Erdogan's recent blast at the United States and the coalition for killing Arabs and Turkmen,
Yeah.
and which he called out the Kurds particularly. Is that not reaching out to the Nationalist Party? What are the impediments to a coalition between the Nationalists and the AKP?
Those two are the likeliest partners, actually. In terms of if a coalition comes out, those two would be the likeliest. But the Nationalist Party, also in the campaign, made a very big deal of the ongoing corruption investigations. I mean, this is also, you say all kinds of things in the campaign, sometimes they come back and haunt you. I mean, you know, and if you make this such a central plank of your election and people vote for you thinking that if you come to power you will go after these corrupt people, and turning around publicly is difficult. But outside of that, I think you are absolutely right. Turkish Islam, unlike other Islamist movements in the Middle East, has always been very nationalistic. I mean, their idea of their relationship with Kurds or the history with Armenians, Greeks, etc., their approach has been very centered on Turkish identity and nationalism. On that level, I don't think there would be much of a divide between them.
Yeah, that was much of my question, but would you speak to the issue of the educational level in Turkey in terms of higher education, and did that have any influence on this as well?
Yes.
The corruption?
Yes. Well, corruption, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but educational level, there are many ways in which you can look at Turkish experience in the 20th and 21st century and see it as a tremendous success. From a country that was maybe 16 million at the most, 90% rural, 90% illiterate, you come to a country that is today, very modern, dynamic, and so it's not just last 10 years, 20 years, it's history, and the result is very impressive. But then when you look closely sometimes, just like the press and the judiciary, the institutions' weaknesses, education, I think, is one area where Turkish modern sort of project has come short in many ways. I mean, you can see the people, one way of thinking about this is people who had more of a rural background, they were poorer, and in terms of their families, less educated, moved into the cities, and they had more opportunities. They became educated, and now they're representatives, prime ministers, and presidents. But when you look at it, you see that the education they received as they moved through the public system, not really adequate to deal with the demands of a modern society in some ways. That's a big clash. I mean, you do see people who are not very well educated, and I'm not, degrees themselves go to a certain extent, they're important, but also I'm also thinking about the kinds of things that you learn about history, about politics, about society. It's not a very, and then I looked at this actually in some detail throughout the 20th century, what percentage of Turkish national income was spent on defense as opposed to education. And one way of dealing with this was, in the last years, was open as many universities as you can, and all over the country. There are more universities than I can even count. But it is not really, it's not enough just to call something a university, and I'm not saying it because I work at one here, but I know that. So it is, and then that translates to people who vote. The people vote on the basis of their basic interests and what they see, in the political leaders who they can relate to. and they become, somewhat easy to manipulate if they're not open, if they're not that kind of competition. So I think that is a big weakness. I can go on this for a long time if you want, but they had a survey. This was a Pew, done by the Pew Research, and they asked U.S. and European countries in the survey, and asked some basic scientific questions about what turns around what. Is it the sun, or is it the moon, is it the earth, and what is, very basic science literacy. And only 3% of the respondents in Turkey were able to score 70% or higher in this. 3%.
Well, what happened if that test occurred here?
Yeah.
30%, not very good. Not very good in the U.S. either, but again, and this is really, so this is, in a way, I think it is at the heart of a lot of things I see.
So it looks like the number 2 party that's more left, more center, didn't really change. It's kind of stuck at 25%. And I'm wondering if that's, because that's just sort of their natural limit. Most of the country is more religious, or are they lacking a dynamic leader? And also linked to that, if there's sort of the heir of Ataturk, was his popularity really only that big as far as?
I think, so in terms of Republican People's Party, I think there is the party that went through different periods in its history. And there was a time when they were a lot more leftist in their outlook, and they were able to really come to power a couple of times in small coalitions and a single party. But I think they suffered from their historical sort of baggage in a way. This is a party that's been in existence now since the beginning of the Republic. So they are, in name, they are associated with some of the policies against Kurds, for example, and like any party who's been in and out of power for a long time, it's very hard for them to disown some of the periods, some of the things that went on in the 20th century and earlier periods. And there is a devoted group of followers for this party, and that is pretty much 25%, unless they open up, which they tried to do in these elections actually. Maybe, as time goes on, they'll be even more successful. But unless they open up and address more to this middle group that I mentioned that's looking for a proper representation, that is their fundamental basis. Now, Ataturk is a very curious kind of situation. I mean, he's an incredible personality cult around him. He is really the only leader from 1920s whose picture is still on the national currency. I don't think anybody is left. Lenin is gone. So he's still, there's this deep sort of, reverence, and I think it is right to do. I mean, really, he's an incredibly effective political leader for his time. What he accomplished is incredibly important. But he died very young, actually. I'm a young person. He was younger than me. He wasn't even 60, actually, when he died. He's been dead a lot longer than he lived, if you think about it that way. So compared to his dynamism, in a way, compared to his ability to respond to his times, really, to come from the Ottoman context and then think about this Republican project and put it into effect in a very short period of time, since his death, he has really become an excuse for all kinds of political groups to do all kinds of things in his name. And like any personality cult, it becomes very hard to decide where he ends and where the real Atatürk begins or whatever. So I think that is, he will continue to be a very important name in Turkey, but it is it's really, like I said, it is just, even the Kurdish party, which is really inconceivable. Kurdish party in campaigns were using his photographs because it meant that they were making a statement against Erdogan. So it's a difficult, it's a very difficult meeting.
I just want to ask, the majority of the votes Kurdish party received were, as they declared it after the results of the election, were the borrowed
Yeah,
votes from the Social Democratic Party, the second,
Yeah.
the first opposition party, Republican, and the Islamist part of the Erdogan's party.
yeah.
Do you think being a nationalistic Kurdish party and have links with the, armed struggle they have against the government and the state for a long time, will they be able to cope that, because the borrowed up votes
Yeah.
covering on this house?
Yeah, I think
Because
this is- yeah.
many people, in each family, Social Democrat family, somebody voted for them to get rid of Erdogan
Yeah.
and to stop his presidency.
No, I think that is, a lot of people voted strategically just to make sure that the party got the threshold and got representation in the parliament. And a lot of people have, they're skeptical because, like I said, there's this core in the Kurdish party that comes from armed struggle against Turkey and the democratic credentials. Some people are skeptical, so it is really uncertain. So it depends. I mean, so Erdogan's hope is that if there is another election, these votes that went to the Kurdish party will revert back to Erdogan, and some of it came from the Republican People's Party. But that's true. It is.
I'm interested in the role of the economy, both in propping up Erdogan
Yeah.
while the economy was good
Yeah.
in the face of worldwide recession. The role now when the economy is not so good. I'm wondering if you could reference that in some way to their attempt to be part of the European Union, which I believe you championed.
Yeah.
And that was really popular.
Yeah.
Like I read this one thing, 70% of the country was in favor of joining.
Yeah.
But after some European politicians spoke in highly, inflammatory in other ways about Turkey becoming a member of the EU, it switched
Yeah.
red to
Yeah.
only 30% being in favor of Germany.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna. The first part, the economy is the growth of Turkish economy in since 2002 is really very impressive. I mean, when you look at it, the numbers, it's very impressive, and it happened at the time when the rest of the world was really suffering all kinds of crises. So Turkey became a success story in some ways, and also became a relatively safe place for investment, both from Europe and from the West. Now, driving this growth to a large extent in Turkey was construction. It's really, there are many ways of thinking about this, but there's a reason why, for example, Turkey wants to build the largest airport in the world. Or if you go to Istanbul, it's just constant. I mean, the construction is just amazing. It's not only construction in Turkey, but also exporting construction activities to former Soviet Union and other Central Asian countries, Middle East, etc. So that's been at the core. Now, the other, so that is really, so construction, then as long as it goes, it generates jobs. But it's also, of course, an activity that's very open to all kinds of corruption, all kinds of, who knows who and how it happens. So there's always been an expectation in Turkey that this will, again, come to a crisis like happened in Turkey, with excess housing, and the prices will go down and there'll be bankruptcies. So far, Turkey hasn't come to that, but this is a construction-driven boom. The other part of it is that it's a boom that was driven by foreign investment. Because Turkey was relatively safe, a lot of foreign money kept coming into Turkey. It keeps coming in. So it has propped up Turkey all this time, and Turkey really depends on the continuing flow of foreign investments to keep its economy going. Now there is right now, actually, so it's one result of this is Turkey has a very huge current account deficit. So on a year-to-year basis, Turkey is really borrowing more than in a way it's able to pay for. There's a deficit that has to be financed on a year-to-year basis. So, so it is numbers look very impressive, but underlying it there is the inherent weakness that comes from construction industries, and the other is the need for continuing foreign flow of capital. So these are things that Turkey cannot control directly, and it can at any moment it can turn and it can really go against it. But you are right, both in terms of numbers and in terms of employment opportunities, etc. This was really one of the reasons that was behind popularity of Erdogan all these years. So as those signs go south, then I think then his support will erode more. European Union is a whole different subject. Erdogan was, I mean, in the early years of AKP rule, Turkey did a lot actually to bring its institutions and policies in line with European Union. And Turkey has now been a candidate member for the 2007, was almost 10 years. Turkey was part of the original group of countries that got together to form what came before European Union. So no other country has gone through this long a period of candidacy without really making real progress. Now Turkey has a lot of faults. Turkey hasn't done a lot of things that it was supposed to do, but I think there are a lot of reasons that come from Europe that prevents Turkey's moving in that direction. So that's, I think now it's a question that's up to Europe. And given what's going on in Europe right now, I don't see Europe going through another phase of expansion and bringing in new members. We're trying to shape the members that they have. So, and then for Turkey, though, I always said this in other contexts too, having that openness relationship with European Union has been good for Turkey, you know, for politics, etc. So I value that relationship, and I think that some kind of relationship will continue. If it was to be cut off for some reason completely, I think that would be bad because it acts as a brake against, you know, the excessive tendencies of people like Erdogan having that relationship.
I was in Turkey for 10 days before the election, and by the way, the infrastructure is impressive. And a number of non-Kurds told me that they were going to vote for the Kurdish party because they despise Erdogan and his dictatorship tendencies.
Yeah.
However, after the election, the honking of horns had barely stopped in the southeastern cities, and there was already talk about how this election would be the impetus for Kurdistan. Given that that Turkish Kurds make up about half the Kurds in the world, in that area, is this a good strategy for the Turkish party? And number two, does Erdogan regret permitting them to participate in the electoral process?
The second is, will Erdogan permit?
Permit?
Regret. Oh,
Yes,
oh,
regret.
Channel
Yeah, I know. So, but I think the first part of your question is a very important question. I think the rhetoric since the elections has been very, coming from the leaders of this party, has been very Turkey focused. So, and they have to be that. I mean, there are some laws, and we can't really advocate for secession and things like that. And we can't. So, and they realize, you know, there has been episodes in Turkey where representatives from that part of the country were forcefully removed from the parliament. You know, duly elected representatives because they spoke Kurdish in the parliament, for example. They were taken directly to jail and they ended up spent in prison. So there were times like that in Turkey. So in a way that's been, but like I said, there is a core in the region who have much more radical interests in terms of Kurdish nationalist interests. But the party has to really govern in a way that's really continues to stay focused on Turkey. But if you leave all that, for Kurds in Turkey, some kind of an association with any part of Syria or Iraq and being drawn into that region is not a very attractive solution, because there are more Kurds outside of historical Kurdistan today, in Istanbul, for example, than there are in that part. So there are a lot of Kurds in Istanbul, there are a lot of Kurds in Europe. And part of their success politically is because they are part of Turkish economy and society. So when it comes down to it, I mean, there are those ideas about, Kurdistan, independent Kurdistan, but in terms of their economic and political interests, I think staying more linked to Turkey is much more important for them. And also Kurds, even though they're ethnically Kurds, it's not a completely unified group either. There are linguistic differences, historical differences, so that's how I see it. In terms of regrets, who knows?
I just want to stay a quick follow-up on the HDP, which it seems there are, it is going to be buried under the weight of expectations, right? These are political novices. They've never had reached that very high 10% threshold before, and now they are the anti-Erdogan party. But are we overstating perhaps how significant, they reached the threshold, big threshold. You're expecting about 9%, they got 13%. Are we really talking about maybe a 4% anti-Erdogan swing in that party, which is not actually that significant? Or is it more significant than it looks?
I think, I mean, you're right. In terms of numbers, you really, again, I have to go back. This is a tremendous success again for AKP. If you forget about the context, all the Erdogan, etc., their percentage is almost twice as much as the second party, RPP, and 24% was the 40. And this is the 8th in a row that they've come out on top. And even if they have elections tomorrow or 5 years from now, nobody expects AKP to lose in a major way. So that is what it is. Now for this HDP, there are novices. I said they're young people. But they've been very, they've been very successful in really navigating. I mean, they've been successful in the very fact that they decided to run as a national party. A lot of people, very experienced politicians, thought that it was a mistake, because they thought that there was no way for a party that is identified with the Kurdish cause to get 10% nationwide. So they had to have a 10% of vote nationwide in order to vote. So politically, they already proved that they are good politicians, because good politicians need to gamble sometimes, and they gamble and they won. But they are very much, I mean, they seem to be led by a very capable person who seems to be aware of the tremendous responsibility that places on his shoulders, and not only for Turkey, but for Kurds themselves. I mean, when it comes down to it, there are a lot of expectations coming from the Kurdish regions on this party. So it's a very difficult situation for anybody, and for them especially. So what they do in this interim period will be important to show whether this was just a fluke of 4% and all things will go back to normal, or this may become the basis for further growth and emergence of a new kind of movement.
Under Erdogan, press freedom in Turkey has greatly suffered, with many journalists being imprisoned and any criticism of them being aggressively prosecuted. But for an election result like this, I feel like there must have been some outlet for free political discussion. Did that change away from television and papers more towards social media? Where did they find that outlet?
I think it's mostly social media, because you are right that like everything else in Turkey, media is also very polarized. and there are some very big newspapers and televisions that are very close to Erdogan and his family. It's owned by his son, some of them. So it's a very, so what they talk about is very one-sided, very pro-government, and very intolerant of even the mildest criticism that may come from other sources. He has been known to go after even some very wealthy people in the press, trying to bankrupt them with, trumped up charges of tax evasion and things like that. So he tried to control it very effectively, and it has had consequences. I mean, a lot of journalists were fired. Rather than dealing with this issue, people just get rid of some of the controversial names. But when I look at it, you're absolutely right. I think social media plays a very important role. There are a lot of web-based publications, not only Twitter and all that, but there are some blogs, but also newspapers that appear only on the web, easier to circulate. It looks like they played an important role. And it was also an election that is very unlike here. It goes on and on and on. In Turkey, elections season is not very long. It was very concentrated in a relatively short period of time. And it's not it's a big country, but not like here. So if you go to Turkey during elections, it looks like everybody's involved in the demonstrations and all these things. So it's a very face-to-face kind of thing.
About a 6-week election period?
Yeah, something like that. It's very good.
There was a big turnout in this election. Does that represent this significant increase in people who are involved? I don't know what turnout has been in previous elections.
It's usually high in Turkey. This is on the higher, but it's always, it's never less than 70, close to 80%. I think this is also another indication that, people take these seriously, and unlike, some other countries, we did not know the results. People knew that if they voted, it will make a difference. And then especially if the margin, of victory was too close, people were afraid that there would be some, shady deals, so people wanted to make sure and express their preferences. But it is, Turkey went through a lot of difficult periods in its history, but it has been, for all intents and purposes, a democratic country for most of the 20th and 21st century now. We've had elections every 4 to 6 years, sometimes more with local elections, and you've never had anyone win with 99% of the vote.
But do you think these are new voters?
Say again?
Do you think these are new voters?
I think, that's a good question too, yes. Turkey is a young country, but yes, there are a lot of people who are new voters, and a lot of them were coming from this younger background, as I said, who were really interested in new ways of doing things.
So we know that Erdogan has not been particularly magnanimous in victory. And I don't think it's unfair to say that this is a defeat for him. He'd actually wanted 400 seats and got 258, so that was kind of a big slam down. So I don't think we can expect him to be particularly magnanimous in this defeat either. What ways, and this was a legislative election, so Erdogan sits separately, this hasn't affected his office. What ways does Erdogan have, assuming we get a coalition, that he could subvert, undermine, or otherwise mess with a coalition government to reposition him and his party, the AKP, to not suffer the same kind of defeat in the future?
So he, we have to kind of realize, first of all, that Erdogan is his power, political power, comes partly from the policies and from what happened in Turkey, but he also has a tremendous charisma. He does have, in Turkish political scene, people who vote, a significant part of the people who vote for AKP vote because of him, really. There is this kind of, and that he's been able to form that kind of bond with a very large electorate. Now, for the next phase and what he can do in his position as president and how he can control things, it's really very uncertain right now because in theory, Turkey has a powerful prime minister and the president is supposed to be more a ceremonial post.
And it used to be.
Yes, and Erdogan was prime minister, and most of the time, I mean, you think about places like Germany or even Israel, you don't even know the president, you know the prime minister, and that's Turkish system. Now, when Erdogan became president, the person who became prime minister is a well-respected person, is a former foreign minister, but he's not doesn't have the political charisma that Erdogan has, and he's not. This was also a test for him whether he can actually manage to win another election for AKP like Erdogan had been doing. They won, but of course the results are not what they expected. So, one thing that will be important to see is whether you will have now. This may lead AKP to say that we need another strong political leader if we want to continue to be a party in power and govern. So in other words, have another prime minister who can actually have the charisma and the influence, which automatically would mean a rival to Erdogan, right? So that is one route if they go that route. The other possibility, of course, is for him to make sure that these attempts at coalition fail, and then there's another election. Somehow they squeeze in enough votes, and they get to form some kind of a government with a weak prime minister, which means in practice he continues to run the show. Knowing his record, especially in the last 5 years or so, that's probably the option that he prefers if he can do it. But I personally expect, I don't know, people who follow these may have different opinions, but I've been expecting that there will be some kind of a counter movement, some pressure coming from within the party, realizing that, the status quo is not really helping them. Because you're talking about a lot of parliamentarians, representatives who lost their jobs, they didn't get elected, they were punished, and now they're in a position of, maybe a coalition. Maybe there will be a coalition, you never know, maybe AKP will be completely out, and then the other opposition parties may get together, which is a big, kind of unknown. So that might be another option that from within the party you may have. But I think for him, again, knowing, seeing what he has done, that is probably the option he would prefer, somehow having a weak prime minister that's beholden to him, and that's so he can, even if he is not constitutionally the president, executive president, that he runs things.
Okay, last question.
According to the Hurriyet this morning, there looks like the MHP was actually reaching out to the AKP to form a coalition, but that they were going to have to, they had 3 things that needed to happen. One was to look into the charges.
Yeah.
And the other one was the anti-terror, and I can't remember what the second one was. The other thing I saw in the Hurriyet this morning was that the Prime Minister is being counseled by his party to separate himself from the government.
Yeah.
If that happens, then they're able to get this guy to stand on his own feet. Do you know if everyone is still working on a parallel parliament?
Parallel parliament meaning?
That he has built this palace.
Oh, the shadow cabinet.
The shadow cabinet.
Yeah. I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't know. But if there is a, you want to believe that people are good fundamentally and they will do the right thing. But then at the same time, as I said, with him, especially since Gezi, everything he has done is really exactly the opposite of the protests.
Yes.
So the opposite of what you hoped to get. So I don't know what what he may be doing on that level. But AKP and AHP coalition would mean probably the end of the opening towards Kurds. If that happens, because one part of the that opening has been a ceasefire from Gaza, which has been very, very important. If that ends, if that opening ends, then that would really make the Southeast very volatile, and I think that is really, that's one concern I would have. Ideologically, those two are the closest to each other in terms of the coalition. But it is, it's a strong opposition between RPP and the Kurdish party, so there will be a limit to how much they can do. But that is one question I would have. But the other, Erdogan's running things in a parallel fashion in the shadow cabinet. I guess he's capable. I mean, he can build a palace with 1,000 rooms.
It's actually 6,000 rooms in the middle of Ataturk's forest.
Well, on that note, I'm not sure if that's encouraging or not. When you say you'd like to believe the best in people, you know there's a but coming from that. But on that note, Reşat, thank you again
Thank you
for
very
joining
much.
us and helping us